Hey everyone, I just finished reading Shamanic Nietzsche by Nick Land from Fanged Noumena for this channel. Can't really see the title there. I didn't intend to leave any notes or comments during the reading, but that ended up happening. I find it not only helpful for my own brain to keep track of what's going on, to kind of mentally take notes out loud, but maybe it would help you guys listening make sense of some of the more difficult parts. So I kind of apologize. This essay contains a lot of quotations, and I did insert my own notes sporadically throughout, especially towards the end, but I tried to always make it really clear when it was me taking a break and me talking to help with the interpretation. I think Shamanic Nietzsche is a really helpful essay to understand because I think it expresses a lot of Land's thoughts, and I think that's why it's helpful. And I really appreciated his kind of deep dive of Rimbaud's work in it, because I wasn't really aware that I've never read Une Saison en Enfer by Rimbaud, so it was really cool to see so much of the tie-in. And yeah, so I hope you enjoy the reading, and I hope that my commentary wasn't distracting. I really think that you should have a background and a pretty strong foundation in Nick Land's ideas. Non-visual ways to understand Nick Land, I really recommend his interviews with Justin Murphy, the 3-hour episode on Justin Murphy's podcast Other Life with Nick Land, and then after that one, listen to Nick Land on the Hermetics podcast. I think that'll give you a really solid grasp of just the basic tenets of his belief. And I think obviously having an understanding of Christian theology and an understanding of Nietzsche's refutation of it will also really help you understand this essay. Any questions, let me know. Thanks for listening. Shamanic Nietzsche by Nick Land in Fanged Noumena. Quote, God said to Nietzsche, "That'll teach you irritating little creature." Anonymous graffiti. Will Christendom ever reap the whirlwind it has sown? That it should try to pass, without the vulnerability of interval, from a tyranny to a joke, is certainly understandable. But that its enemies should do nothing to obstruct its evasion of nemesis is more puzzling. How can there be such indifference to the decline of our inquisitors? Is it that they succeed so exorbitantly in their project of domestication that we've been robbed of every impulse to bite back? Having at last escaped from the torture palace of authoritarian love, we shuffle about, numb and confused, flinching from the twisted septic wound of our past, now clumsily bandaged with the rags of secular culture. It is painfully evident that post-Christian humanity is a pack of broken dogs. Georges Bataille is the preeminent textual impediment to Christianity's carefully plotted quiet death, the prolongation of its terminal agonies into the 20th century. Having definitively exhausted itself after 2 ugly millennia of species vivisection, Christianity attempts to skulk away from the scene, aided by the fog of supine tolerance, which dignifies itself as postmodernity. It does not take a genius to see whose interests are served by this passage from militant theism to postmodern ambivalence. A despot abandons any game that begins to turn out badly. This has been the case with metaphysics. From Kant onwards, exploratory philosophy ceased to generate the outcomes favorable to the established theistic power, and we were suddenly told, "This game is over, let's call it a draw." The authoritarian tradition of European reason tried to pull the plug on the great voyages at exactly the point they first became interesting, which is to say, atheistic, inhuman, experimental, and dangerous. Schopenhauer, refusing the agnostic standoff of antimony, was the first rallying zone for all those disgusted by the contrived piece entitled The End of Metaphysics. Bataille is his most recent successor. The forces of Antichrist are emerging, fanged, and encouraged from their scorched rat holes in the wake of monotheistic hegemony, without the slightest attachment to paralytic tinkerings of deconstructive undecidability. Quote, "An attitude which is neither military nor religious becomes insupportable, in principle, from the moment of death's arrival." George Bataille. The war has scarcely begun. It is hard to imagine anything more ludicrous than Descartes or Kant having erected their humble philosophical dwellings alongside the Baroque architectural excesses of the church, standing in the shadows of flying buttresses and asking pompously, "How do we know the truth?" It surely cannot solely be due to Nietzsche that we see the absurdity of an epistemological question being asked in such surroundings. When a philosopher has a priest for a neighbor, which is to say, a practitioner of the most elaborately constructed system of mendacity ever conceived upon earth, how can a commitment to truth, in such a positive sense, even be under consideration? Truth in such situations is a privilege of the deaf. There is no question of error, weakness in reasoning, or mistake in judgment when addressing the authoritative discourses on truth in the Western tradition, those cathedrals of theological concept building that ground our common sense. No. Here one can only speak of a deeply rooted and fanatical discipline of lying. In other words, one fraction of the radicality of the atheistic thinking escalated through Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Bataille is that it overthrows the high bourgeois apologetic epistemological problematic in Western philosophy by asking clearly for the first time, where do the lies stop? The great educational value of the war against Christendom lies in the absolute truthlessness of the priest. Such purity is rare enough. The man of God is entirely incapable of honesty, and only arises at the point where truth is defaced beyond all legibility. Lies are his entire metabolism, the air he breathes, his bread and his wine. He cannot comment upon the weather without a secret agenda of deceit. No word, gesture, or perception is slight enough to escape his extravagant reflex of falsification. And of the lies in circulation he will instinctively seize upon the grossest, the most obscene and oppressive travesty. Any proposition passing the lips of a priest is necessarily totally false, excepting only insidiouses whose message is momentarily misunderstood. It is impossible to deny him without discovering some buried fragment or reality. There is no truth that is not war against theology, and even the word truth has been plastered by the spittle of priestcraft. It cannot be attachment to some alternative conviction that cuts here, but only relentless refusal of what has been told. The dangerous infidels bypass dialectics. It is the skeptic who assassinates the lie. Whenever its name has been anything but a jest, philosophy has been haunted by a subterranean question. What if knowledge were a means to deepen unknowing? It is this thought alone that has differentiated it from the shallow things of the earth. Yet the glory and also the indignity of philosophy is to have sought the end of knowing and no more. Once blatant sophisms are exempted, the fact that skepticism has never been enacted is the sole argument of the dogmatists, and it is a powerful one despite its empirical flavor. There can be a little doubt that the philosophical advocates of disbelief have tended to exploit the very convictions they profess to despise as the shelter for an insincere madness. As was the case with Socrates, philosophy has sought to peel itself away from sophism by admitting to its ignorance, as if unknowing were a pathos to be confessed. Profound sanity, sane, out of one's mind, alone is effective skepticism, in comparison to which skeptical philosophies fall prey to naive theories of belief, as if belief could simply be discarded or withheld. We know nothing, of course, but we do not remotely even know this, and the mere assertion in no way ameliorates our destitution. Belief is not a possession, but a prison, and we continue to believe in achieved knowledge even after denying it with intellectual comprehensiveness. Their refusal to accept a dungeon is no substitute for a hole in the wall. Only in a voyage to the unknown is there real escape from conviction. The dangerous skeptics are those Kant fears, a species of nomads, despising all settled modes of life, who come from a wilderness tract beyond knowledge. They are explorers, which is to say, invasion routes of the unknown. It is by way of these inhumanists that the vast abrupt of shamanic zero, the epoche of the ancients, infiltrates its contagious madness onto the earth. Epoche being a word from ancient Greek that he's using. Epoche is a word attributed to Pyrrho by way of indirect reportage, but in its absence, the philosopher's name would lose what slight sense invests it. Although it might be argued that we owe epoche to Pyrrho, it is from epoche that the name Pyrrho comes to us as a cryptograph of the unknown. Even were it not for Pyrrho's silence, a silence far more profound than that literary abstinence of Socrates, epoche would surely not be something of which we could straightforwardly know the truth, far less a method or a subjective state. Epoche is a report of the abrupt and an escape. The following is a quote from Nietzsche's Will to Power. 1. 2. The world of phenomena is the adapted world which we feel to be real. The reality lies in the continual recurrence of identical, familiar, related things in their logicized character, in the belief that we are able to reckon and calculate. 3. The antithesis of this phenomenal world is not the true world, but the formless, unformulable world of the chaos of sensations. Another kind of phenomenal world, a kind unknowable for us. 4. Questions what things in themselves may be like, apart from our sense of receptivity and activity of our understanding, must be rebutted with a question: how could we know that things exist? Thingness was first created by us. The question is whether there could not be many other ways of creating such an apparent world. I'll repeat that. The question is whether there could not be many other ways of creating such an apparent world. Nietzsche, The Will to Power. How much industrialism lies buried in the notion of thought, as if one could ever work things out. One does not think one's way out, one gets out and then sees that it wasn't one. Bataille's Nietzsche is not a locus of secular reason, but of shamanic religion, a writer who escapes philosophical conceptuality in the direction of ulterior zones, and dispenses with the thing in itself because it is an item of intelligible representation with no consequence as a vector of becoming, of travel. Shamanism defies the transcendence of death, opening the tracts of voyages of discovery never reported. Quote from Rimbaud. Against the grain of shallow phenomenalism that characterizes Nietzsche readings, Bataille pursues the fissure of abysmal skepticism, which passes out of the Kantian noumenon, or intelligible object, through Kant and Schopenhauer's thing in itself, stripping away a layer of residual Platonism, and onwards in the direction of acategorical, epochal, or base matter that connects with Rimbaud's invisible splendors. The immense deathscapes of a universe without images. Rimbaud. Matter cannot be allotted a category without being retrieved for ideality. And the Nietzschean problem with the Ding an sich was not its supposed dogmatic materialism, but rather that it proposed an ideal form of matter, as the transcendent quarantine site of integral truth, as a real world. There are no things in themselves because there are no things. Quote, thingness has only been invented by us owing to the requirements of logic. Nietzsche, The Will to Power. Which ultimately revert to those of grammar. The Ding an sich is a concept tailored for a God, supreme being, desperately seeking to hide itself. A cultural glitch turned nasty, but on the run at last. Quote, root of the idea of substance in language, not in beings outside us. Nietzsche, Will to Power. Quote, Nietzsche, Will to Power, the antithesis of the apparent world and the true world is reduced to the antithesis world and nothing. Okay? So my addition here, it's not a binary between what we perceive and then what's real. It's a binary between, or a antithesis between what we perceive in the world and absolutely nothing. Void. Okay. Materialism is not a doctrine, but an expedition, an alpine breakout from socially policed conviction. It is, before anything else, the obstinate negation of idealism, which is to say the very basis of all philosophy. Exploring acategorical matter navigates thought as a chance, and matter as turbulence beyond all regulation. Turbulence beyond all regulation. It yields no propositions to judge, but only paths to explore. This is Nietzsche as a fanged poet at war with the philosophers, with the new priests, a thinker who seeks to make life more problematic. Bataille locks onto a desire that resonates with the reality that confounds us, and not with a rationality that would extricate us from the labyrinth. Nietzsche is the great exemplar of complicating thought, exploiting knowledge in the interest of interrogations. And this is not in order to clarify and focus, but to subtleize and dissociate them. Complicating thought strengthens the impetus of an active or energetic confusion, delirium, against the reactive forces whose obsessive tendency is to resolve or conclude. Rebelling against the fundamental drift of philosophical reasoning, it sides with thought against knowledge, against the tranquilizing prescriptions of the will to truth. If Nietzsche is locked in an extraordinarily furious struggle with philosophy, it is because it is philosophy that has claimed, with the most cynical explicitness, to negate problems. Philosophy has always wanted to retire. Schopenhauer is simply its most honest exemplar. The absolute is humanity's laziest thought. Nor does it suffice to argue that thought can be complicated within itself, or, as the philosophers have said for some time, immanently, for we know where this path of thinking leads. An intellection in need of immanent critique is one that is already nudging against an ultimate solubility. Quote, the intellect finds its limits within itself, unquote. It does not even need to move to consummate interrogation. It is thinking such as this, whose most imminent model is the Kant of critical philosophy, that generated such distrust in Nietzsche for writers who work sitting down. Wisdom, Sophia, substitutes for traveling, hollowing it out in a Baudelairean caricature of the voyage, redundantly reiterating a moral dogma, and to love it is to seek to be still. In obedience to narco-Platonic eros, philosophy defers to the end of desire. Nietzsche reaches back beyond this Hellenic priest philosophizing and forward beyond its modern limit, reassembling Sophia as escape. Quote, Nietzsche, The Gay Science. Indeed, we philosophers and free spirits feel, when we hear the news that the old God is dead, as if a new dawn shone upon us. Our heart overflows with gratitude, amazement, premonitions, expectations. At long last, the horizon appears free to us again, even if it should not be bright. At long last, our ships may venture out again, venture out to face any danger. All the daring of the lover of knowledge is permitted again. The sea, our sea, lies open again. Perhaps there has never yet been such an open sea." End quote. The death of God is an opportunity, a chance. It makes sense to ask what is meant by the word noumenon, but chance does not function in this way, since it is not a concept to be apprehended, but a direction in which to go. To the one who grasps what chance is, how insipid the idea of God appears, and suspicious and wing-clipping. Quote George Bataille. That was. Monotheism is the great gatekeeper, and where it ends, the exploration of death begins. If there are places to which we are forbidden to go, it is because they can in truth be reached, or because they can reach us. In the end, poetry is invasion, and not expression, a trajectory of incineration, either strung up in the cobwebs of paradise or strung out into the shadow torrents of hell. It is a route out of creation, which is to each their fate interpreted as enigma, as lure. Quote, "Now a hard, an inexorable voyage commences, a quest into the greatest possible distance. I said goodbye to the world." Arthur Rimbaud quotes. Even the most angelic curiosity, when multiplied to the power of eternity, must find its way to end in the abyss. It can seem at times as if Bataille owes almost everything to Christianity. His understanding of the evil at the heart of erotic love, the hysterical affectivity of his writing, along with its excremental obsession, its epileptoid conception of delight, its malignancy, the perpetual stench of the gutter. Yes, this is all very Christian, well attuned to a doctrine gestated in the sewers of the empire. Yet, from out of the aberrant intensity and disorder of Bataille's writings, an impossible proposition is perpetually reiterated, that far from being the acme of religion, let alone its telic blossoming, God is the principle of its suppression. The unity of Theos is the tombstone of sacred zero, the crumbling granitic foundation of secular destitution. This is so exorbitantly true that the existence of God would be an even greater disaster for him than for us. How infinitely trivial the crucifixion of Jesus appears beside the degrading torture of being God. After all, existence is so indistinguishable from defilement that one turns pale at the very thought of an eternal being's smell. Perhaps this is why God is, quote, profoundly atheistic, Bataille, leading Bataille to remark that, quote, "Whilst I am God, I deny him to the depths of negation," close quote. Quote, "Nihilism might be a divine way of thinking," Nietzsche anticipates. God can only redeem the universe from its servility by burning his creation into ash and annihilating himself. Such is the, quote, "God of blinding sun, this God of death that I sought," Bataille. Bataille invokes the dark undertow of a self-butchering divinity. Quote, "God of despair, give me your heart, which no longer tolerates that you exist." Close quote. If God is an explorer, then there is no God. Bataille's texts are a hecatomb of words without gods or reason to be, led back down through the crypts of the West by a furious impulse to dissociate theism and religion, and thus to return the sacred to its shamanic impiety, except that nothing can ever simply return, and hell will never be an innocent underworld again. The depths have become infernal, really so, quite irrespective of the fairy tales, we are still told. Quote, "Flames surround us, the abyss opens beneath our feet," close quote, reports Bataille from the brink of the impossible. Quote, "An abyss that does not end is in the satiate contemplation of an absence," quote, close quote, "because its lip is the charred ruin of even the most sublime subjectivity." Quote, "I have nothing to do in this world," he writes, "if not to burn. I suffer from not burning, approaching so close to death that I respire it like the breath of a lover." Close quote. This is all Georges Bataille. It is not only due to the Inquisition that all the great voyagers have for a long time been singed, For well over a century, all who have wanted to see have seen. No profound exploration can be launched from the ruins of monotheism unless it draws its resources from damnation. The death of God is a religious event, a transgression, an experiment in damnation and stroke of anti-theistic warfare. But that is not to say it is preeminently a crime. Hell, I conceive of this as being like Moloch. Hell has no interest in our debauched moral currency. To confuse reactive dabblings in sin with expeditions in damnation is Christian superficiality. The Dantean error of imagining that one could earn oneself an excursion in hell, as if the infernal too was a matter of justice. Our crimes are mere stumblings on the path to ruin, just as every projected hell on earth is a strict exemplar of idolatry, made up images by humans. Transgression is not a criminal action, but a tragic fate. The intersection of an economically programmed apocalypse with the religious anti-history of poetry. Sorry, I really love that phrase, economically programmed apocalypse. Very apt for Nick's ideas. It is the inevitable occurrence of impossibility, which is not the same as death, but neither is it essentially different. This ambivalence responds to that of death itself, which is not ontological, but labyrinthine, a relapse of composition that is absolute to discontinuity, yet is nothing at the level of immanence. I'm going to reread that part because it was a bit dense. This ambivalence responds to that of death itself, which is not ontological, but labyrinthine, a relapse of composition that is absolute to discontinuity, yet is nothing at the level of immanence. The very individuality that would condition the possibility of a proprietary death could only be achieved if death were impossible. One dies because discontinuity is never realized, but this means that there is never one who dies. Instead, there is an unthinkable communication with zero. Immanence, zero, immanence, or the sacred. There is no feeling that throws one into the exuberance with greater force than that of nothingness. But exuberance is not all annihilation. It is the surpassing of the shattered attitude. It is transgression. Quote, the question of mere truth of Christianity, whether in regard of its origin, not to speak of Christian astronomy and natural science, is a matter of secondary importance as long as the question of the value of Christian morality is not considered. Nietzsche. My note. So Nietzsche is saying here that it doesn't really matter Christian explanations of the natural world. What really matters is the question of the Christian morality, and is that even real? Which is obviously fundamental Nietzsche. That quote is from The Will to Power. What if eternal recurrence were not a belief? The most extreme form of nihilism would be the view that every belief is necessarily false because there is simply no true world. That is Nietzsche from The Will to Power. Bataille suggests, quote, the return immotivates the instant freeing life from an end, and in this ruining it straight away. The return is the desert of one for whom each instant henceforth finds itself immovated. Okay, that's George Bataille. Not really sure I could paraphrase or explain that one. All right. Christianity, the exemplary moral religion, substituted slow suicide and representation for shamanic contact with zero interruption, being death. But without the reemergence of nihilistic recurrence, caution, prudence, every kind of concern for time to come is restored to the senselessness of cosmic noise. Okay, I'm going to reread that part. Christianity, the exemplary moral religion, substituted slow suicide and representation, belief, for shamanic contact with zero interruption, which I'm saying is death. But with the reemergence of nihilistic recurrence, caution, prudence, every kind of concern for time to come, is restored to the senselessness of cosmic noise. With recurrence comes a future which is not the prolongation of myself across time, but the expiry of a being going further, passing attained limits. A religious crisis can no longer be deferred. In the final phase of Nietzsche's intellectual life, the eternal recurrence is grasped as a weapon, a hammer, the transmission element between diagnosis and intervention, where Christendom recuperates decline to preservation, deflecting it from its imminent plummet to zero. Eternal recurrence reopens its abyssal prospect, precipicing affect onto death. This is the predominant sense of selection in Nietzsche's texts, a vertiginous extrication of zero from the series of preservative values, cutting through the ambiguous and cowardly compromise of a religion such as Christianity, more precisely such as the Church, which instead of encouraging death and self-destruction, protects everything ill-constituted and sick and makes it propagate itself. Quote Nietzsche, The Will to Power, obviously. The notes assembled into section 55 of The Will to Power, by Nietzsche, develops this morbid thread. Either existence as it is, without meaning or aim, yet recurring inevitably without any finale of nothingness, a box, or the nothing, the meaningless, eternally. The nihilism of recurrence is ambivalent between its Christian historical sense as the constructive deceleration of zero and its cosmic, non-local virtuality as a gateway onto death. I'm going to read that one again. The nihilism of recurrence is ambivalent between its Christian historical sense as the constructive deceleration of zero and its cosmic, non-local virtuality as a gateway onto death. Okay, I'm not sure I'm going to understand that sentence, but I have to move on. Christendom is to be attacked because it was its morality that protected life against despair and the leap into nothing, which is the phrasing of Nietzsche. Quote, morality guarded the underprivileged against nihilism. Supposing that the faith in this morality would perish, then the underprivileged would no longer have their comfort, and they would perish. That was Nietzsche. The religious history of mankind is based upon the techniques of ill health, dehydration, starvation, mutilation, deprivation of sleep, a general self-destruction of the underprivileged, self-vivisection, poisoning, intoxication. A journey was underway which Christian preservative moralism, generalized species cowardice, privatized, representationalized, crushed under the transcendent phallus, froze, obstructed, and drove elsewhere. Christianity is a device for trapping the sick, but recurrence melts through the cages. The whole thing is a quote. What does underprivilege mean? Above all, physiologically, no longer politically. The unhealthiest kind, in all classes, furnishes the soil for this nihilism. They will experience the belief in the eternal recurrence as a curse, struck by which one no longer shrinks from any action, not to be extinguished, but to extinguish everything. Struck by which one no longer shrinks from any action, not to be extinguished, but to extinguish everything. Side note, my notes here, I feel like in this case, Nietzsche is kind of using recurrence, this idea of like the recurrence of nihilism, in a sense that kind of taps into like the positive feedback loop of cybernetics and evolution and capitalism that Nick talks about, where it's this like accelerating, brutal process of extinction of the inferior. And that Christianity is like the moral system that protects the inferior from being concerned with this like brutal feedback loop that we're all kind of tied into. All right, end of my notes. To relate sickness to death as cause to effect is itself a sign of health. Their morbid interconnection is quite different. Sickness is not followed by death within the series of ordered representation. It opens the gates. Genealogy does not reduce sickness to a historical topic, since sickness, the inability to suspend a stimulus, eludes mere unfolding in progressive time, tending towards the disappearance of time and epochal interruption. The reflex spasm at and by which reactivity gropes is the atemporal continuum beneath the crust of health. Death is, quote, that which has no history, quote, Nietzsche, The Genealogy of Morals. And Nietzsche's method is syphilis. Only religion assures a consumption that destroys the proper substance of those that it animates. I think, my notes here, I didn't know that, I don't know if Land is joking or if Nietzsche really had syphilis, but Nietzsche was a very sickly person. And so I think Land is saying that, like, that opened up a lot of, like, perspective to him onto, like, the nature of, like, this brutal system that we're plugged into as living beings. Okay. Philosophy is a ghoul, ghost, that haunts only ruins. And the broken croaks of our hymns to sickness have scarcely begun. Borne by currents of deep exhaustion that flow silent and inexorable beneath the surface perturbations of twitch and chatter, damned, shivering, claw-like fingers, hewn from torture and sunk into wreckage, drawn with unbearable slowness, down into the maw of flame and snuffed blackness, twisted skewerish into fever-hollowed eyes. Eternal recurrence is our extermination, and we cling to it as infants to their mother's breasts. Yeah, my notes. Further confirming here, eternal recurrence, I feel like, is a really great synonym for this accelerationist, positive, cybernetic evolution notion. It's our extermination. We're going to be cut off by whatever is being produced through us. Okay. Quote, poetry leads from the known to the unknown, writes Bataille, in words that resonate with Rimbaud. Poetry is fluent silence, the only venture of writing to touch upon the sacred, which is zero, because the unknown is not distinguished from nothingness by anything that discourse can announce. To write the edge of the impossible is a transgression against discursive order and an incitement to the unspeakable. Poetry is immoral. Okay. Rimbaud writes from the other side of Zarathustrian descent and death, Untergang, anticipating the labyrinthine spaces of a Nietzsche for the sick, and of what escapes from / due to the cultural convulsion Nietzsche reinforces. Quote, he's really going into Rimbaud here. Quote, the poet makes himself a visionary by a long, immense, and rational deregulation of all the senses. Rimbaud. And this deregulation is a source of, quote, ineffable torture. Quote, close quote. Quote, the sufferings are enormous, Rimbaud insists. No organism is adapted to, quote, arrive at the unknown, close quote, which makes deregulation as necessary as it makes pain inevitable. Our nerves squeal when they are restrung upon the phylogenetically unanticipated. Quote, experiences strike too deeply. Memory becomes a festering wound. Quote, Nietzsche from Ecce Homo. A descent into the inferno. Nuit de l'enfer where the entrails of nature dissolve meanderous into lava, quote, "This is hell, eternal pain," quote Rimbaud, and Rimbaud burns, as is necessary. Yes, the poet must be a visionary. The East knows a true lucidity, but to be an inheritor of the West is to hack through jungles of indiscipline, devoured by vile ants in words unstrung from sense, until the dripping foliage of delirium opens out onto a space of comprehensive ruin. This has never been understood, nor can it be. The foulness of our fate only deepens with the centuries, as the tracts of insanity sprawl. From bodies gnawed by tropical fevers, we swim out through collapse into existence in forever, destined for undue. My notes here. I think this is like the concept of Moloch and the fact that in modernity, like post-Christian modernity, we're also in the posthuman, which I recently heard. Posthuman is when we, as a species, realize that we aren't like the ultimate agents of free will over ourselves or the universe, or like ultimate possessors of free will, and that we actually are tied into systems beyond us, and in a way are like stripped of our autonomy. When humanity realizes that we as a species are like cogs in some greater machine, that's posthumanism. And I feel like that's what he's talking about. The fact that, anyways, okay. True poetry is hideous because it is base communication, in contrast to pseudo-communicative discourse, which presupposes the isolation of the terms it unites. Communication, and the transgressive nonsense Bataille lends it, is both an utter risk and an unfathomable degradation associated with repellent affect. Here I imagine this, what he's talking about, poetry having the potential of becoming, these are my notes, is like babble. Like totally unformulatable and not capable, not following the logic of sense and sequence that we use to understand reality. Nonsense, basically. Okay. The ego emerges in the flight from communicative immanence, from deep or unholy community, initiating a history that leads to the bitter truth of the desertification of the isolated being. From the anxiety of base contact, which it can only experience as dissolution, the ego stumbles into the ennui of autonomy, the antechamber to a harsh despair, whose horror is accentuated by the fact that it arises at the point where escape has exhausted itself, where the ego has quarantined itself to the limit of its being against extraneous misfortune. Ennui is not any sort of response to the compromising of the ego from without. It is not an impurity or a contamination. The negation of such things are for it a condition of existence, but rather it is the very truth of achieved being, the core affect of personal individuality. Ennui cannot be mastered, surpassed, resolved, aufgehoben, because it is nothing but the distillate of such operations, indeed of action as such. Ennui is insinuated into the very fabric of project as the necessity of leaving oneself. My notes, I think this perfectly ties into the emotional realization of this post-humanity, this post-human reality, right? Because he said it is where you realize that you actually we can't escape from these systems that we are subordinated to, whether they be the ecosystem, some sort of like machine intelligence accelerationist system, and it's when this ennui, this, despair, is what happens when we, as individual minds, realize that we're, like, strapped into this extraneous misfortune, like this exterior catastrophe that we're subordinated to. And that's what happens when you actually comprehend yourself as an individual being. That's what he's saying here, I think. Okay. If the soil of Bataille's writing is volcanic, it is not only due to the sporadic convulsions of a devastating incandescence, but also because its fertility is anticipated by a monstrous sterilization. Beneath and before the luxuriant jungles of delirium is the endless crushing ash plain of despair. I believe, quote, I believe that I am in hell, therefore I am there. Rimbaud. Blake might have written such words, although their sense would have been quite different. Drooled from Rimbaud's pen, they point less to a potency of imagination than to a geological crisis of justification, approaching a perfect epistemological irresponsibility. It is not for us to defend the rights of truth. Truth is decreed by the masters. What matters is to adapt, nursing the meager resources of our reactivity from our base cunning. Belief, the cloak of confession, is too precious a resource to be squandered on the zealotry of idealism. What value is there to be extracted from a committed belief, from a last-ditch belief? Such things are for the strong, or for dupes, for the allies and the slaves of light, for those who do not rely on the subterranean passages beneath belief to avoid the panoptic apparatuses. Adaptability can only be lamed by commitments. We have seen enough true Christians, rabbits transfixed by headlights. When draped about the inferiors, beliefs are not loyalties, but rather sunblocks against inquisition. We, creatures of shadow, are hidden from their enlightenment. We believe exactly what they want. The inferior race, quote, await God with greed. Rimbaud. Scavenging at Christ, quote, like wolves at an animal they have not killed, close quote, Rimbaud. Creation, testamental genealogy, the passion of Christ, none of it is their story, nor is it any other, for they are too indolent to have a story of their own. Only theft and lies are proper to them. Pillage. Rimbaud's inheritance, above all, consists of mendacity and sloth. Quote, I have never been a Christian. I am of the race which sung under torture, close quote, he remarks. It is precisely obliviousness to Christianity, to fidelity or duty, to privileged narratives, that eases the inferior race into singing the praises of the Nazarene. The white man has guns, therefore the truth. Quote, the whites disembark. The cannon. It is necessary to submit to baptism, to dress oneself, to work. Close quote, Rimbaud. In contrast to the pompous declarations of the orthodoxies, which come from on high, like a stroke of the whip, an infernal message is subterranean, a whisper from the nether regions of discourse, since, quote, hell is certainly below. Rimbaud. Just as the underworld is not a hidden world, a real or true wahre Welt, but it is that hidden by all worlds. The underworld is not a hidden world, real or true, but is that hidden by all worlds. My notes like oblivion, void, zero, shamanic zero. Hidden by all worlds. So is the crypt mater from hell something other than an inverted scene concept or belief? In their infernal lineaments, words are passages, leading into and through lost mazes, and not edifications. Acquisition is impossible in hell. There is nothing en bas except wandering amongst emergencies. And what is available has always come strangely, without belonging. Okay, my notes here. So he's really saying, yeah, the underworld, the real hell, death, oblivion, Moloch, void, zero, isn't something that is like, that can be juxtaposed juxtaposed with something good in a moral system. So he's not talking about the hell of Christianity, which is something, what he said before, the Dantean conception that you can like do something in your life that like earns you the passage into hell or possibly heaven, that like our moral system is so trivial and superficial in the scope of what's really going on, what would be on the other side of the real world, which is oblivion. And so when he's saying that just the underworld is what is hidden by all worlds, so it's like the opposite of reality, the opposite of existence in consciousness. So the crypt mutter from hell, he's saying, is something other than an inverted scene concept of belief. So it's not the opposite of heaven. That's not what it is. Okay? All right. And then he says, I'm still adding my notes, there is nothing en bas, which is downstairs in French, except wandering amongst emergences. And what is available has always come strangely, without belonging. I feel like he's implying some sort of the, like, I hate to reference Hollywood, but this, like, external force, like, that brings the tools and the evolutionary leaps to the apes in 2001. It's this idea of the like, external synthetic force that is working through us. And so, like, what comes from the underworld, he's saying, comes strangely, like, foreign, without belonging to us, like something machinic. All right, I'll get back into the essay. Infernal lowlife has no understanding for property. Even the thoughts of the inferior ones are camouflage and dissimulation. Their beliefs are mere chameleon dapplings of the skin. Poetry does not strut logically amongst convictions. It seeps through crevices, a magmic flux resuscitated amongst vermin. If it was not that the great ideas had basements, fissures, and vacuoles, poetry would never infest them all. Faiths rise and fall, but the rats persist. Rimbaud's Saison en Enfer pulsates through a discourse without integrity. Teaching nothing, it infects. Like matter cooked through with pestilential, quote, contagions of energy, which is Georges Bataille's wording, it collapses into a swarm of plague vectors. Substance is only its host. Quote, words, books, monuments, symbols, and laughters are nothing but the paths of this contagion, its passages. Nietzsche. I never could conclude anything. Zero does that. Towards new seas, that way is my will. I trust in my mind and in my grip. Without plan, into the vast open sea, I head my ship. All is shining, new and newer. Upon space and time sleeps noon. Only your eye, monstrously, stares at me, infinity.